Alistair, thank you so much. Very generous and kind introduction. Thank you. Right, no slides, folks. So we're going to do this old-fashioned way. And I wanted to. I'm really looking forward to the questions. So I'll leave plenty of time for those. And I'll give a very sort of headline overview of kind of what we're seeing at the moment, what some of the themes are, and then kind of look what to look for the future. So here we go. So just on the headline overall, I mean, unsurprisingly, we continue to see complaint volumes to us rise, and it continues to obviously rise, therefore, for landlords themselves. We're going through pulling together our annual report at the moment, and I'm struck, for example, that our maladministration rate for the last financial year is looking like it's 64%. Will be confirmed in the annual report, but at 64%, that's really noticeably high, much higher than last year. We made 6,500 orders or recommendations last year. Now that's 2,000 more than the year before. And whilst there was an increase in casework determinations last year, it wasn't significantly more than the preceding year. So 6,500 orders and recommendations, 2,000 increase. That's pretty striking. What's that suggest? Well, I think one of the things it suggests is that we're not just seeing more cases, but we're seeing more complicated cases. We're having to make more remedies to put those things right, albeit it will also reflect a sort of change in our practice, development in our casework, to include more around learning and more stretching and orders and recommendations. Compensation over £1 million last year, about 600,000 the year before. It's a quite significant increase in compensation as well, and I'll touch more on that in a moment. Disrepair, not a surprise, or property condition to be more precise. Not a surprise. That's still the lion's share. About half the caseworks, it's gone up a little bit. Not a surprise at all. But other areas, so ASB up 34% over last year, and I reckon within that a lot around noise, which was one of our spotlight reports in the autumn of last year, in October last year. So that's the kind of headlines. So we're seeing more, it's more complex, and we're doing more with the cases that we get. So let's pick up on some themes, and in particular, I just want to pick up on how our approach to investigation is developing, because I think it's important for people to know, important to kind of explain why, but also important to think for landlords to think about, is this something we should do? Is this something we could do as well? So the first thing I'll touch on is compensation. So I mentioned that £1 million figure. So the things to stress here, if you weren't aware, we published revised remedies guidance in October of last year. If you've not seen it, please look at it. So both the remedies policy and the remedies guidance. One of the things which I stress is that it's expressed as remedies, because whilst people will look at the brass tacks of how much compensation was there, remedies are about more than money. And there is, I can't stress enough how much we try and get into where does there need to be a senior management review of a case, where does a policy need to be looked at, as well as other remedies for the individual, like an apology. And increasingly, we're asking for apologies in person, where we see issues, and that's an attempt to kind of rebuild, not only provide appropriate redress, but also hopefully rebuild a fractured relationship between the resident and the landlord. But money, I know, is a significant thing, and so a few thoughts. So we introduced in that October guidance the idea that we would use the rent paid as the starting point for determining the appropriate compensation for the period where we'd established service failure had occurred. And I think that's helped us be really transparent about the sums involved, and we're looking there potentially at a loss of service or a loss of amenity. In addition, it's worth stressing that we will look at for distress and inconvenience and time in trouble. So sometimes I get a kind of question from landlords, which is, well, what, this sum's so different to the sum that we would have done. And it may be that we didn't consider time and trouble, or you didn't really think about the individual circumstances and the distress that may have caused. Instead, a kind of formula, which is, again, a starting point, but the formula and the policy may have been used, but without them thinking about the time and trouble and so on. So I think that approach to applying rent and rent relative to the service failure is obviously leading to some significant awards. I think the highest so far is just shy of £20,000. So that's quite a step change, perhaps, from what people thought previously. The other thing to flag is that in the guidance, we were really clear that compensation shouldn't be offset against any arrears. And that's for a number of reasons. Firstly, the arrears may be disputed and may be something we've not looked at because it's more likely to go to the courts. So, it's not really fair from our perspective to offset against the arrears because the arrears may be in dispute. But also it's about a payment for a service failure that's been established, for maladministration that's been established. And so that should be distinct from any arrears. And then the third thing is just a slightly troubling trend that I've seen, which this is something that wasn't uncommon before, but is perhaps becoming a little bit more common, which is the case being referred to the Ombudsman and the checkbook suddenly being opened. And so there was a case I saw recently where at stage 2, the final stage, the landlord had confirmed that the compensation would be £150. The case is referred to us. At the point we accepted it for investigation after we triaged the case, the landlord reopened its final stage response and offered £4,500 compensation. I think that's really cynical practice, and that's just going to obscure any lessons or service improvements that need to be learned from service failure. So those are some thoughts around remedies and compensation. Next up, vulnerabilities. Anyone looking at our cases, particularly, but not exclusively, the severe maladministration findings, will notice that there may be additional needs identified in the household. There's a case which we're going to publish later this week where in a number of places we say that the Equality Act was not given sufficient regard. To give you a quick summary, the case involves a wheelchair user who is unable to use their home properly because of the floor, issues with the floor and issues with the wheelchair going around. And in a number of ways, and there's 3 parts of the Equality Act that we refer to in this case. The residents was not treated fairly, and clearly reasonable adjustments to the service were not made. And so it's an interesting case. There's more to it than just that. So do read it. It's a very interesting case. But there's a number of cases where we're increasingly referring to the Equality Act or to other human rights legislation. And this shows over the last few months, this is part of a change in approach over the last few months where we really wanted to bring a focus on human rights, apply a human rights lens to our casework. I think what is striking in a number of those cases is that disabilities, mental health, dependents, young children are routinely not recognised, recorded, or responded to. The kind of 3 R's: recognise, record, and respond. And that is, I think, troubling. Where a vulnerable person's policy may exist, it may be okay, may be very good. We're rarely seeing it reflected in practice. So are those policies living and breathing within the organisation? Do people know when to use them and how to use them? We have a call for evidence around some of these issues at the moment for our next Spotlight report. So, and it's open until the end of July, 28th of July, I think. So I strongly encourage you to offer your view, what you're seeing, what you think, through the call for evidence. So please do go on our website. Please do respond if you haven't done so already. So the next one, if that's going to be our next Spotlight report, our last Spotlight report, and Alistair referred to it, is around knowledge and information management. We tried to give it a slightly more enticing title than record keeping, albeit at the heart of it is record keeping, but actually it is about knowledge. What knowledge do you need as an organisation to manage the challenging operating environment in which all landlords are working? And indeed, it talks quite strongly about culture as well. I strongly believe in the line in that report about the record made by the operative in the resident's home. There's a line you can trace to the decision that is made in the boardroom around the 30-year plan. You know, I can't stress enough that it needs to be owned by the whole organisation, and to get the right culture around data and knowledge and information management, people need to understand why sometimes this dry administrative task matters so much. And the legacy that the current housing officers have inherited around knowledge on homes is not as strong as it needs to be. And so whatever happens, this generation needs to leave a better legacy for the next one. And clearly that report highlights how stock transfer, merger, the Almo being closed and brought back in-house, that can be a pinch point for records being lost, knowledge being lost, you know, as well as people assuming that information is on the server when it's actually on an individual device, a repeated issue. So these gaps are really causing issues for landlords in reacting, let alone actually having the information they need to be proactive. And there are 21 recommendations in the report, and I strongly urge you to look at those and to self-assess against those. And indeed, in our decisions, increasingly we are making findings specifically on record keeping. We will make remedies in relation to that report and actions the landlord needs to take, in our view. Right, next thing that people will have seen are our systemic investigations, where we do a deep dive into an individual landlord. One of the striking things about this is that not only are we obviously handling more individual cases, but that also means that there'll be more individual cases that contribute to the themes and issues and recommendations identified in those reports. So we've got one coming up soon, which involves over 100 cases. And we had one in relation to Haringey Council published last week, which had just over 30 cases in there, and really clear lessons. Again, I cannot stress enough that these are issues which may be very pertinent to many landlords. And so please do look at those reports and think about, is this something that we could learn from as well? So let me just briefly do what next. And to be honest, I'm going to focus these primarily around the Social Housing Regulation Bill, which we're obviously expecting roll assent on soon. So there are a number of things in relation to the Ombudsman, but I'm going to highlight three. And the first is the most important. Ooh, they're all important. The first is one really not to lose sight of, let's put it that way, which is our complaint handling code. Just because the code exists at the moment and has been around for 3 years, do not mistake that for the code becoming a statutory document. And so with the Act, when it receives royal assent, we will have a duty placed on us to monitor the code and a legal duty based on landlords to comply with the code. Big shift. And it means, therefore, we're not applying it where we see a complaint. We're applying it wherever without a complaint. And that is a big shift. And so I really would strongly encourage landlords to think about the self-assessments they've done to date and how they need to do those self-assessments to demonstrate that they're meeting their legal duty. The code is one, because obviously we share a membership with the local government and social care ombudsman. So the code is intended to become a joint code with the local government ombudsman as well. All being well, and obviously this is subject to royal assent, but all being well, we would intend to consult on the code, which is a requirement under the statute, in the autumn, and with the intention that the code becomes effective from next year, financial year. The other couple of thoughts on it is I think landlords really need to tighten up service recovery and formal complaints. And this sort of messy space of informal complaint handling can be problematic for landlords. Often the loss of information, mismanaged expectations, actions not being completed can arise from that kind of that void between a service recovery and a formal stage 1 complaint. So really think about that part of the process. The other thing is that the current code requires or encourages a member responsible for complaint handling at governing level. And it should be the whole boards should be thinking about this, but it's one of the things which we put in there, and it's one of the things we probably expect to see developed. You should expect to see developed when we do the code consultation in the autumn. So there'll be a particular focus on the role of governing bodies and learning from complaints and trying to get more structured practice and consistent practice around learning from complaints. So that's the code. Two others, which I'll deal with briefly. Wider orders or learning orders. So just to remind folk, under the current statute, we make remedies orders that have to be complied with in relation to redress for the individual. Typically, we would recommend wider stuff. Often we'll see an order around a case review or something very specific arising from the case, but a wider thing may be dealt with as a recommendation. We expect 2 months of royal assent, and subject to a scheme change for us, we would introduce learning orders. So that moves into the space of compliance, and also I think those could be quite important in relation to really trying to get to the root causes of service failure. So space to watch. And then the final part of the bill, which I'll just flag, is obviously our best practice and asking a landlord to self-assess against best practice. That we're going to spend a bit more time developing. So that will come. I think it'll be really invaluable, really build on our work that we do at the moment around spotlight reports and elsewhere, but we'll spend a bit more time developing that and engage with the sector in due course. Right, that's me, Alistair. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that, Rick. I was particularly interested in the bit about the change in legislation. I think that's fascinating. Now, there were some questions coming up in the chat. Let me just see if I can find those. 2 seconds. There we go. Oh my goodness, a long questions. Aisha, do you want to ask your question first? You all set?
Oh, it wasn't a question. It was just a comment. It's just a comment.
Right. All right. Do you want to perhaps
yeah,
share?
fine. Yeah, thank you, Richard. That was really interesting, really useful comments. I love the spotlight report. So I do a lot of legal work for disrepair for network homes, and I love what you guys are doing around the positive elements in terms of your advertising when people have done good things, not just a negative aspect. It was just a comment about when you said about not offsetting the damages against the rent arrears. I completely appreciate it is a separate, you know, it's a separate case. The only thing is we do like to ask the resident if they do want us to do that, only because if they've got high rent arrears, the way we see it is we're going to end up taking them to court anyway for possession of the property. And I'd rather prevent that by asking them if they want us to lower those arrears down. That's the only reason we do it. So we do offer that. Sorry, yeah, it was just a comment, basically. It wasn't a question. Thanks.
Have you got you perhaps want to respond to that, Richard?
Yeah, sure. I think you demonstrating that through the compliance is fine. I mean, that I recognise that, and if the resident's been given the choice and you can clearly demonstrate that's the approach and the residents accepted it through the compliance, and that shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, great stuff. Now, Emma, you've got a very interesting point. Do you want to speak up, Emma Ettridge?
Yeah, thank you ever so much. It was just around learning from complaints and your comment, Richard, about the negative views about cases being reopened and then potentially further redress being offered at the point that the resident has gone to the Housing Ombudsman service. Like, we have put in place some learning mechanisms from complaints, and it does sometimes pick up that we didn't quite get it right, even though it was at stage 2. And what we like to do is we obviously like to put it right there and then. And the resident on some occasions has also been going to the Ombudsman service at that point because we quite rightly didn't get it right. But the problem for us and the negative space that we feel that we're in now is, even though we're putting it right and we are offering additional redress, be that monetary or other means, we are then criticised in the investigation reports for putting it right, and have been on occasions, well, I know at least one occasion, the offer of redress from the Housing Ombudsman has factored in the case that we actually put it right after the event, so they were offered more money because of that. And it's like, we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. We want to obviously review our complaints process and learn from where we've gone wrong and still gone wrong, but then it's not recognised that we're trying to put it right. We're actually being criticised for putting it right after the event. So that was quite an interesting comment that you made there.
Yeah, okay, let me come back on that. And it's a really valuable opportunity, and thanks for sharing your thoughts and reflections on the cases that you've seen in relation to your work. And a couple of thoughts. So the first is that there is a really strong principle that we have as a scheme that we would encourage the earliest resolution of a complaint. And one of the things which I'm always at pains to stress to landlords is just because it's been referred to us doesn't mean that you should stop doing, putting something right that you should have done. So in the past, we've said, well, look, just because someone's complained, this is in the normal complaints process, if you like, because someone's complained, don't think, oh, well, we won't do the repairs until we've responded to the complaint or something like that. It's like, well, you should provide your service and respond to the complaint. And, and that goes even when the case is referred to us. If you see, oh, we really dropped the ball on this and there's something we can put right, then you should. However, that shouldn't be confused with, obviously mistakes have been made. There's been maladministration, not necessarily only in the complaint handling, but in the substantive area as well. And, and therefore it's incumbent on us to identify that maladministration. I think as a scheme, we're unusual actually in the sense that we have a finding which is called reasonable redress. And we use that where a landlord has obviously there has been a service failure, but it's recovered it through the complaints procedure. And so we'll make that finding, and that's a really important finding. And I think that's a fair finding to recognise for landlords that, that they have a mistake's been made, but they have sought to put it right. Now, where something has been, now the specific example I gave was where something has been not only referred to the Ombudsman, but accepted by the Ombudsman, and then there's been a substantial payment and compensation. Do you think that was going to happen if the resident didn't refer the case to the Ombudsman? And if you do think that that was the landlord's plan, that routinely it just reopens cases here and there and decides to change its compensation levels, then I think that's an unusual practice. I would suggest it's one which is probably better done during the formal complaints process. But I also think that it's stretches credibility that that is something that was not influenced by the residents' tenacity to keep bringing the complaint through the process and to us. So I think there is a distinction between the kind of that practice which I highlighted and you saying, okay, the Ombudsman's now looking at something, we've got an evidence request, we can see that we've made a mistake, and our findings do reflect that. So we may not find reasonable redress because obviously, again, it's ended up with us. But we will sometimes say, look, this would have been maladministration or severe maladministration if the landlord had not taken this action, and albeit the action is late, very late sometimes, but it has taken it.
I think my point in the case that particularly that I have concern with is the fact that this particular case, we were actually criticised and compensation was awarded more for the fact that we tried to put it right after it went to stage 2 and you guys had accepted it. I mean, the case that you're saying is it's meant like mad that it's such a high level of change, and we're not looking at high levels of change, but for us we were criticised at that point for trying to put it right via our learning mechanisms, which I found completely odd.
Okay.
So
well, I think you, well, firstly, we shouldn't talk about an individual case probably in this forum, but
no.
you know, if it's still in the review period, then if you think the decision is wrong, you should review the ask for a review of the decision. That's done by an independent team, and they will change it if it if it is wrong. But I mean, if the compensation changed, sometimes, and I tried to highlight this in my compensation, sometimes a landlord will say to us, well, we don't understand why you pay more compensation, and we'll say, well, because you didn't consider time and trouble, for example. So, you know, that's why, yeah, you know, there was a loss of heating and you have a formula for paying for loss of heating, but you didn't think about the inconvenience or the time and trouble it took. And that's sometimes the reason for the differences.
Good. Well, thanks. Claire's got what I think is a very good question at the precision of deadlines and timetables. Do you want to ask your question, Claire?
Sure. It feels like quite a basic question, this, but it's one that we've been struggling with, and perhaps one good one to put in the consultation. But yeah, we've been trying to get guidance on when response timescales kick in for, you know, the turnaround for responding to complaints on time, and we're finding that some organisations are saying, particularly where they're bigger, well, actually we allow 3 days processing, so we allow it to come in and then to be kind of allocated and logged and so on. Whereas we start it on the day that it's actually received, even if it takes a day or two to get to it, given backlog and so on. But given the TSM measure around this, obviously, and trying to get a consistent view across the sector in terms of how we're performing about responding to complaints on time, I guess it'd be just good to get some clarification on that, even in the new code. And also in filling out the complaints handling code assessment, we're kind of struggling to know, do we report against compliance with that policy or compliance with performance? And in the past, you know, we did in the old code, you reported on performance, but now, you know, are you compliant if you're compliant with policy, but not necessarily responding to everything quite on time? So quite technical, basic questions, but nevertheless, ones that we're grappling with as we're trying to get it right, basically.
Yeah, thank you. Really valuable questions. And look, let me take some of that away for the consultation. But on your two kind of points, on the first around that kind of additional 3 days for processing, I mean, the code has a 5-day window for a landlord to acknowledge the complaint, and then you get into the stage 1, stage 2. So I kind of So there's a 5-day window there. So it's whether that 3 days is in addition to the 5 days or part of the 5 days, or, you know, so, and then on the second one around the self-assessment, very good point. So it may be that the self-assessment has are you compliant in policy, and then what's the practice? That might be something we tease out, but we are working on that. And as I say, the intention is to consult in the autumn.
I think there's a question from Jeff. Let's just see where we are. Yes, I Colchester are singling themselves out for special treatment here. Jeff, do you want to ask your question?
So it's a very quick question. Will the housing ombudsman investigators have or get a housing qualification?
Are you thinking of professionalism and all of that? Yeah. Well, I mean, look. So we have a wide range of folk who come in, and we've been going through recruitment, as you know. So we've got lots of people who may have worked at a landlord previously, got lots of people who may have worked at another ombudsman, and we got lots of people who work in the legal field, or, you know, regulators or something like that. We have our own assessment. I mean, basically the answer is no, on the basis that they don't need it to do the job that they're doing. But what they do need is to be able to pass our assessments, and obviously then they're into continuous training and improvement. And it's pretty competitive to become, you know, an investigator or adjudicator at HARS. When we did our recruitment last year for about 150 roles, not all casework roles, but for about 150 roles, we had 8,000 applicants. So it's pretty competitive process, and there's a whole lot of tests that people have to go through before they are then even allowed to do the induction, and then before they're allowed to do casework and so on. And then they have to go, there's 3 casework tiers you have to go through. I won't bore you with all of it. Basically, there is a robust system for being an ombudsman. That is a different skill set for being a housing officer.
Yeah, but when I went to see Richard, Jeff, a couple of years ago, not long after he was appointed, the woman that took me up to the office gave me the test for being a financial ombudsman before I was even allowed to talk to Mr. Blakeway. So they certainly take training very seriously indeed. I'll draw a veil over whether I passed the exam or not. Now, there's another question came up in the chat. Let's just say it's it's Emma. Shall I just read it out, because we're running a little short of time now? It's about plans to increase the level of customer service being provided by the Housing Ombudsman. Struggle with callbacks. Effectively, it's about the backlog. I think it isn't it? And also, my particular issue is: do the reports need to be so long? Or is there no possibility of summarising these? I've been pestering Mark Lawrence about this in recent weeks, as you may know.
Yeah, I look at the one on Thursday. It's a long report, but it's really good. I think it's there's some ombudsmen that just do a letter, but like one side, and I'm not sure about that either, because one of the striking things about last year was that 2/3 of residents whose complaint we did not uphold thought the outcome was reasonable and fair. Okay. And I kind of do think actually so we do work on length of report and all the rest of it, and not having repetition in it. But on callback, right? So, well, let me try and deal with kind of 3 quick points. So the first is that one of the things which we're doing at the moment, and if you're involved in this, a big thank you. I hope it's working for you, is this development of the online portal for people to submit evidence. It will work. It will go to casework updates and all of that. So that will be really valuable, I think, for providing information for people, and be able to submit evidence if you're a landlord and so on. So that's part of our digitisation of our elements of our service. We're also working on the kind of how we can do call handling. I mean, they deal with phenomenal volumes. I mean, we get a phone call, a contact now every minute. So it's, so I'm very conscious that some of the callbacks need to be more timely, but that's just a reflection of kind of just the volumes coming on determinations. we're starting to see the benefits of the additional resources coming in. So in the last quarter, we determined about 1,300 cases. You know, that's about double what it was for the Q1 last year. You know, go back a decade, that's what Huls would have done in a year. So I think you're starting to see that those resources come on. It takes a bit of time because we've got to recruit all these people and then make sure they're capable of doing the case, like before they're let loose on cases, but it's starting to see those benefits.
Good. And I mean, Rachel from BPHA is asking about level of contact between yourselves and a new complaints team, and I'll leave it for you to maybe chat to Rachel about whether it's possible to have a chat about that. But the last question I wanted to ask, Richard, if you don't mind, is obviously at the moment you're running a couple of investigations. As part of that, you refer the case to the regulator of social housing, and it's just some reflections on how you think you're working with the regulator on those cases and more generally might be of interest to people.
Yeah, I mean, we okay. So under the Act, under the Social Housing Bill, subject to it being an Act, we have a statutory memorandum between the two organisations. Got one at the moment, but that's going to be a process of kind of drawing breath, reflection, and and so on. We're really involved in the TSM and the TSM development, so there's really good engagement there. There's tons of engagement going on, and I'm sure many folk will have seen Kate and I at like sort of roadshow, unplanned roadshow almost, but they're talking at stuff. I mean, when we refer where we make a severe maladministration finding, and the regulator does its own work, and then obviously they will see the reports on not just the spotlight reports, but more particularly the reports perhaps on individual landlords and those paragraph 49 reports or systemic reports, and those are written. So if I come back to they're two independent separate bodies. If neither exists, if the other one didn't exist, we'd still do our job. But because we both exist, it's kind of quite beneficial. And I see the kind of regulator as still quite top-down governance, systems, inspection, and an ombudsman is a bit more bottom-up, although we do have the tool of inspection, but a bit more bottom-up and aggregating casework into lessons and so on. In a co-regulatory environment, I think that top-down, bottom-up is really valuable for landlords. And I think whilst it was unplanned, obviously because of the events that happened, I think the spotlight report on damp and mould, and then the regulator requesting assurance from landlords following the Albert Ishak inquest, it's clear from the regulator that many landlords were using that spotlight report to think about their approach, and therefore were able to offer assurance to the regulator, which satisfied the regulator perhaps more than it might have done without that report. And that, I think, is a really good kind of, as I say, unplanned but good example of how the two work. And then, sorry, just jumping back to those systemic reports, I mean, we will publish them with the intention that that's lessons for the landlord, our recommendations for the landlord. If the regulator does nothing with it, that's still our report, and those lessons are still important. That the regulator may, for its purposes and through its work and its evidence gathering, take subsequent action, is notable, but I think not the intention of those reports by us.
Right. Great stuff. Well, thanks for that, Richard. That was a very illuminating presentation. As ever, I learned a lot.